This is our 80th sequel of the Church of Uganda at 150 years, a celebration of our history, the history of the church, which goes alongside the history of the state. I'm Christopher Amos Ntambi Chikomeko, the author, and in today's sequel, in 1910, Mika Sematimba, the Makamba, he was therefore a chief in Uganda. So the Makamba went to the Seychelles Islands and exhumed the remains of Ssekabaka Mwanga II and successfully returned them home. This sequel is the opener in a series that will take us to almost sequel number 83. And so, the Buganda chiefs tirelessly reminded Apollo Kagwa the Katikiro of the need to convince the colonial rulers to return the remains of the fallen Ssekabaka Mwanga II. Why was this important? So that Daudi Chwa II would cease to be referred to by the natives as the Kabaka designate. Why? Because he had never performed the ritual that would make him the Kabaka. What was that ritual? To cover a backcloth on the dead body of his father, for that would be the act of accession in Uganda. So, in a letter, which I have seen this time at the Uganda National Archives, dated the 18th of February 1907 and written by Governor Hesketh Bell, he was asking the British Prime Minister then, who was Sir Henry Campbell Bannerman, to initiate the repatriation of the remains of the fallen Mwanga II. He had to ask the British Colonial Secretary, the Right Honourable Victor Bruce at the time, who was also called Lord Elgin, to get in touch with the Seychelles governor, who at that time was Walter Edward Davidson. Lord Elgin did not see it fit in 1907, and so he turned down the request of Uganda Governor Sir Hesketh Bell, and that is where the affair died. However, in 1909, a gap arose. It was a leadership gap, both in Uganda and in Great Britain. For example, Sir Hesketh Bell had retired, and there was no immediate replacement for him. As a matter of fact, there was no replacement until the year 1911, when a substantive governor, Sir Frederick John Jackson, was actually appointed and he arrived. Now, this gap, 1909 to 1910, enabled Apollo Kagwa and his fellows to push for the fallen Mwanga to exhumation. Because after all, Lord Elgin, the colonial secretary who was the stumbling block, had also left power in Britain, and that's what I'm calling a gap. There was a completely new government in Great Britain, and it was led by now Prime Minister called Right Honourable Herbert Henry Asquith, and his colonial secretary was the Right Honourable Robert Crewe Mihes. And the new government agreed to the exhumation, and the Seychelles Island governor, Walter Edward Davidson, he was still the same governor as in 1907, granted Apollo Kagwa his government's request of many years to exhume Mwanga II remains. So one of the consorts of the fallen Mwanga II was Salima, who was born in the Seychelles and who was a Seychelles native, but had since come to Buganda. Now remember, there was also another Salima, who was a Muganda, and then there was also Dois Mwanomu, Bakazikubao. All of those women were with Mwanga in the Seychelles, but they had now since all come to Buganda. And you remember the baby, Mary Mazi, being the daughter of the Seychelles Salima, and therefore that's why she was a half-caste. However, Apollo Kagwa had asked Doisi Mwanomu to pretend to be the mother of Princess Mazzi, or Mary Ruwedde Mazzi. Now, it was decided by Apollo Kagwa that Salima should return home to the Seychelles Islands, and that was the chance when Mika Sematimba was going, because Mika Sematimba was not going alone. He was to lead a big delegation of porters and other officials, although the porters would remain at the coast until he returns from the Seychelles. So Mika Sematimba, very well-known envoy, I may even call him the permanent envoy of Buganda to Zanzibar, Mika Sematimba, the Makamba, the chief of Makamba in Kisozibudo. He was to make the journey, and he was to be accompanied by an official called Petero Yona Balizakiwa. Oba Balizakiwa. Let me speak it in Luganda. Balizakiwa. And now that Apollo Kagwa wanted Salima to return to Zanzibar, and she had been told that she was to return to Zanzibar for good, Apollo Kagwa wanted to erase Salima's history in Buganda. Now, the Clement Hill steamer took Mika Sematimba, Salima, the Seychelles woman, and concubine of Mwanga, mother of Mary Ruwedde Mazzi, and they headed for Jinja. When did they leave? They left on the 7th of July 1910, and they were in the company of some 10 other porters. But now you see, the porters were not walking on foot anymore. They were going by ships and train. We are in 1910. So they left Port Luzira, passed through Jinja, and onwards to Port Kisumu, or Port Florence if you want. Mika Sematimba was in his 3-piece Edwardian suit, complete with a hand-held waistwatch and trill-by hat. When he boarded the train first-class compartment at Kisumu, which was always reserved for Europeans only, but because he had a special pass as a diplomat, Buganda's permanent envoy to Zanzibar, a full diplomat. However, Salima and Balizakiwa sat in one of the second-class wagons, while the 10 porters sat in the public third-class section of the train. And therefore, the journey from Kisumu to Nairobi and then later Mombasa began. And I prefer to call it the Kuchi Kuchi, because that was the sound train. Then, of course, it reached Nairobi in the morning, and then in the evening, the traveling party went on to Mombasa, where they arrived on the 9th of July, 1910. I noticed here that the speed of the train had increased. Earlier on, we saw it spending almost 5 days to 6 days, but now I can see it's almost 3 days journey. So there was an improvement on the train. Mika Sematimba took his 10 porters to Fredericton Church Station, where he left them in service of the Church of the Christian Missionary Society. Remember, that was the earlier headquarters. They were to stay there until his return. So for them, they were not going to accompany him to the Seychelles. Seychelles had workers. All he wanted them was to carry, I think, the box of the remains once it arrived onto the train. But that will be later. So Sematimba, together with Salima and Balizakiwa, the other official who was going with him, spent the night at the Fort Jesus Hotel in Mombasa. Why? Mika Sematimba was still busy with the ship bookings and also arranging for his return journey in advance, so that when he returned, it was just a matter of getting onto the train and back to Buganda. In fact, they did not leave for Zanzibar till the 12th of July 1910 by a steamer ship. They finally left Mombasa and arrived in Zanzibar, where they boarded a ship called the British India Company steamer ship, and they left Zanzibar on the 15th of July 1910, and they spent 2 days at sea. They did arrive at Port Victoria on the Seychelles. That is Seychelles' largest island, Mahé. And Mika Sematimba and his colleagues on Mahé Island, they arrived there on the 17th of July, 1910. And they were received by the officials from the government house. And they were taken straight to a hotel owned by Mr. H. Longael, where they rested. Salima woke up very early in the morning to go home to her parents, but Sematimba insisted that they had to go together. Victoria Town, which is the biggest city in Mahé, Mahé being the largest island of the Seychelles, had by that time 3 main streets. The first street was called the Royal Street. The other street was called the Albert Street. And the main street was called Victoria Street. The traffic was made up of a few carriages pulled by natives and donkeys. And with that, Sematimba delivered Salima to her parents with gifts. Which gifts? They were not recorded. And also he gave them an assurance that Salima had been returned home to stay. She was not going to be taken back to Uganda anymore. However, for the next few hours, Sematimba told that family that he needed them. He needed them as eyewitnesses to the exhumation exercise of the remains of the Feren Mwanga II. First of all, because they were the natives, and you never know what might happen later. Their being there as independent people from the government would add some value. You never know. So Salima family members got ready to attend to the exhumation as Sematimba and Peter Oyona Balizakawa went to begin the process with the authorities. Sematimba headed for Government House, where all the documentations required were sorted out. The officials then formally lodged the papers at the Department of Civil Status at the Supreme Court building, which in modern times is now called Treasury and Courthouse building. The exhumation was authorized, and the state workers began the exercise in the presence of the Salima family members, as Mika Sematimba had requested. This was at the Mount Freuli Cemetery. So Peter Oyona Balizakiwa narrated later on his return to Uganda that they found the grave covered with sand and was simple to dig up. But after digging about 5 feet deep was where they found the cemented concrete cover, and it took several hours to dismantle it and gain access to the aluminium metal box that was sealed completely. Now, aluminium is known to resist corrosion because its surface always is made up of a thin layer of oxide film. It is resistant to acids and bacteria and therefore free from decomposition, deterioration, rust, decay, wear, and any weathering. That is why the coffin was found in perfect condition after so many years. Peter Oyona Balizikiwa or Balizekawa brought out a small banana plantain which by then had withered, and he planted it in the middle of the exhumed grave to the astonishment of the local people. Salima explained, in her language of course, that the ritual to them in their local was explained to her by Bagarayaze, her co-wife, who he left in Buganda, but who had also lived in Zanzibar, in Seychelles during the time of Mwanga, that she had explained to her, and that she had actually gave the plantain to her. The plantain was given to Salima, and told her what to do. So it is Salima who then, of course, handed it over to Balizakiwa. The officials took the aluminium metal box remains to the mortuary at St. John Hospital on the La Lanchantia Road in Victoria, Mahé. The hospital was a private one which had begun as early as 1875 and was owned by the missionary Sisters of St. Joseph Docluni. The aluminium metal box was disinfected with an old jelly before its top was cut in the presence of the government officials, the Salima family members, as well as the Mika Sematimba and Peteroyona Balizakawa party. The myrrh and chemicals in which the remains lay had a bad odor, but the remains appeared fresh and natural. The head or face of the remains were duly recognizable, although the head had dismembered. It was no longer part of the body, and this was explained as normal and expected by the medical officers who were present. Even the clothes in which the remains were found were intact, but the medical officers refused anyone to touch them and returned the top, which was then sealed using some chemicals. Mika Sematimba had bought a giant wooden box at the Zanzibar former slave market, and it was that in which the remains in their compact aluminium metal box were placed, and the journey to Buganda therefore could commence. Brethren, this week, as we look at this exhumation, may the good Lord bless us all. Tomorrow, this exhumation exercise and the journey to Buganda continues. May the good Lord bless us all.